A gift or a curse? A few hours had passed since the group left Nomengard behind, winding down the narrow mountain trails. The spring sun had risen higher, its rays growing stronger and warmer as they pressed onward. Beneath its gentle heat, their cheeks tingled, as if the sun itself welcomed them out of the dark tunnels they had departed. Yet every so often a cool gust of wind still slipped from the mountains, reminding them that winter's chill still lingered. Their good mood from the gnome's gratitude remained a quiet undercurrent. No one felt the need to comment on it aloud. Instead, they busied themselves with tightening straps, shifting burdens, and testing sure-footed steps on the shale track. Only the crunch of boots on stone punctuated their steady, companionable silence. Near the head of the line, Morthal Pashtor paused and adjusted the fit of his helm. The cleric's calm eyes swept across his companions. He offered a nod to Alara Morningvale, who stood a few yards ahead, scouting the slope. The elf, lean, dark-haired, with twin swords strapped over his back, raised a hand in acknowledgement. Though Alara didn't smile, he seemed marginally lighter than when they first ventured into Nomengard's depths, as if the quiet success had peeled back a layer of his guarded demeanor. Behind them, Zira Darkmire's elegant footfalls tapped a hesitant rhythm. She fiddled with a black velvet ribbon braided in her hair and tugged on the collar of her tailored traveling cloak. A short distance behind Doreen struggled to keep pace. She stopped to twist around and hoist her overstuffed pack higher on her shoulders. The straps creaked, and some metal tool inside clanged ominously. With a grunt, she tried distributing the weight, unsuccessfully. Before anyone could ask if she needed help, Doreen barked a short laugh that came out more strained than amused.
"If I keep carrying this, I'll have shoulders like a half-orc,"
she said, trying to sound casual. No one teased her, but Zira glanced over her shoulder with a wry lift of her eyebrow. Balin's stone hammer trailed at the rear, his heavy boots leaving neat prints in the loose gravel. The dwarf squinted at the bright sky and kept his two-handed glaive resting against his broad shoulder. More than once, Morthal looked back at him, as if waiting for the dwarf to draw nearer, to walk alongside them. Balin only cleared his throat and maintained a careful distance. By midday, the terrain shifted. The broken rock path gave way to stretches of mossy ground, where streams from melting snow from the mountains trickled. They picked their way across slick stones. At one crossing, Doreen's boot slipped, and she let out a sharp curse. Her backpack nearly pulled her sideways into the shallow water. She managed to regain her footing, but emerged with damp trousers and a sour expression.
"That blasted pack's more trouble than it's worth,"
Zira said, her tone lofty.
"I've half a mind to set it on fire just to lighten your load."
She spoke as if joking, but the gleam in her eye dared Doreen to make a snappish reply. Instead, Doreen just rolled her eyes and tightened her grip on the shoulder straps. Morthal, noticing the tension, stepped forward and held out his hand to Doreen as she climbed the muddy bank.
"Next crossing. Let one of us help,"
he said quietly, meeting her gaze.
"We're in no rush. Your shoulders must be aching."
Doreen opened her mouth as if to protest, then gave a small shrug.
"I can manage,"
she said. She let his hand guide her the last steps. He did not press the issue, and she did not thank him. But the slight dip of her head acknowledged something resembling gratitude. As the sun angled downward, they reached a flat area sheltered by a cluster of stunted pines. Here, Morthal called a halt. The ranger's sense that Alara carried inside him, though Alara would never call himself a ranger aloud, told them this was a decent place to rest. No fresh predator tracks, a modest breeze that kept insects at bay, and enough dry wood scattered about for a small cooking fire. Zira sat on a stump, lifting her boots to check for scratches on the fine leather. Doreen took the opportunity to shrug off her pack. She let it fall with a solid thump that made her wince. For a moment, she rubbed the red marks on her shoulders, Morthal busied himself with preparing a small meal, dried bread, some salted meat, a handful of preserved berries. As he worked, he cast another glance at Balin. This time, the dwarf looked up. Their eyes met for the span of a heartbeat. Morthal's look was gentle but firm, as if to say, "I see you." Balin shifted and began to sharpen the blade of his glaive with a whetstone, the rasp of metal against stone filling the silence. No words passed, but Morthal's jaw tightened slightly, as though saving a conversation for a moment when privacy would allow honesty. Ilara came over to the fire circle, unslinging his bow and laying it carefully at his side. His posture was straighter, but he kept his distance from the others. Zyra bent toward him, her tone conspiratorial.
Ilara, tell me, did you see the size of that mimic we dealt with? I swear it was as big as a pony, though those gnomes insisted it was no larger than a barrel.
She tried to sound light-hearted, hoping to coax a smile or at least a word from him. The elf tilted his head, considering. A faint smirk ghosted across his face.
It was large enough to swallow any poor gnome whole. I'm glad we intervened.
His voice, quiet and measured, seemed to ease the edges of tension in the camp. Even Doreen let out a soft snort as she dug through her pack, possibly looking for something to ease her aching shoulders. A soft evening breeze rattled the pine needles overhead. As dusk settled, Morthal offered short shifts for watch. Zyra volunteered first, adjusting her skirts so they wouldn't drag in the dirt as she perched atop a rock with a decent view of the slope they'd descended. Doreen joined her, wiping her brow with a linen scrap, determined to keep watch alertly despite her fatigue. In the dim glow of the campfire, Zyra caught Doreen's eye.
You know,
She said softly.
if you're so determined to carry half a workshop in that pack, you might at least let us help now and then.
She pretended to examine her fingernails, feigning nonchalance. Doreen huffed a quiet laugh.
Sorry. I'm not exactly known for trusting others with my valuables.
She said, carefully choosing the last word. A branch cracked in the darkness. Both women tensed, Doreen's hand drifting toward her rapier, but it was only a hare bounding through the underbrush. Still, the moment's tension left a residue of alertness as they settled into a watchful silence. The night passed without incident, though strange cries echoed somewhere far above the cliffs. When morning came, Ilara appeared at the camp with a hare caught by the traps he had set up earlier. Gray clouds gathered overhead, muting the light that filtered through. They had miles to go before reaching the archaeologists' camp, and the wind threatened rain. The day wore on. The sun dipped beyond a ridge just as they approached a gorge where colossal iron gates stood battered but upright. Ancient dwarven craftsmanship etched into the metal had been worn down by centuries of weather and misfortune. The settlement beyond was little more than stony ruins and toppled columns. Moss and lichen clung to everything, and the wind hissed through these broken halls as if whispering old secrets. Ilara tensed, shoulders rising as he drew both swords.
Smoke,
He said quietly.
I smell old cinders. Perhaps a campfire ahead.
Zyra adjusted her cloak.
Let's not go barging in without sense.
Zyra murmured, smoothing a lock of red hair behind one ear. She wanted to appear nonchalant, but her eyes flicked around nervously. They advanced carefully, but the hush was broken by a voice, rough and wary, calling, "Who are you?" "This is private territory. Turn back." The voice came from behind a jagged boulder. A warning, not a welcome. Weapons were half-raised, tension like a drawn bowstring, but Zyra stepped forward, arms spread to show empty palms, her voice as honeyed as a minstrel's chorus.
We mean no harm.
She called, injecting her tone with the right blend of warmth and earnestness.
We're from Phandalin, sent by Sildar Winter to warn you. Danger stirs in these mountains. A white dragon, orcs, who knows what else. We've come to help.
She paused to give space for her words to settle. After a moment of whispered conference behind the rock, two dwarves emerged, Dazzleen Greyshard and Norbus Ironrune. Dazzleen's beard was woven into intricate braids, and his broad grin revealed a genuine curiosity. Norbus's eyes were more skeptical, darting from one adventurer to the next, cataloguing their weapons and armor. "Sildar, you say?" Dazzlin asked, stepping forward. "All right, then. Dull the blade and share our fire. We're not monsters." He shot a look at Norbus, who simply grunted. At the dwarves' campsite, the group learned of Dazzlin and Norbus's archaeological efforts. They had found a temple of Abathor, the dwarven god of greed, buried behind that ruined settlement. Balin spit at the mention of Abathor.
Greedy God, greedy times,
he said, voice gravelly with disdain. And yet, old ruins draw us dwarves like moths to flame, answered Dazzlin. Norbus nodded. Except we can't get far inside. 2 ochre jellies keep us at bay. Slimy devils cling to the ceiling. We dared not risk our necks alone. Zyra tossed her hair and laughed lightly, though she eyed Morthal to gauge his reaction.
Ochre jellies. We've handled trickier foes,
she said. Doreen smirked, winking at Zyra as though to say, "Let's show them what we can do." They formed a plan. Zyra and Ilara would lure the jellies, raining spells and arrows. Doreen and Morthal would hide inside to flank them. Balin would support, as needed, ensuring no jelly slipped by. Before they moved, Morthal caught Balin's eye.
Stay close this time,
he said gently. No accusation in his tone, just the weight of trust. Balin's cheeks darkened slightly. He gave a firm nod. Entering the shadowed temple was like stepping into a secret history. The stone walls bore carvings of dwarves paying homage to a pile of gold, and the stale air smelled of ancient dust. Zyra's fingertips glowed with arcane fire as she cast a firebolt upward. Sparks danced across the cavern ceiling, illuminating 2 wobbling masses of ochre slime. Ilara released an arrow that thunked solidly into one jelly, causing it to quiver in agitation. With a soundless ripple, both jellies began moving along the ceiling toward the door. At Morthal's signal, Ilara and Zyra backed slowly, feigning weakness. The jellies oozed forward, mindlessly hungry. When jellies reached the doorway, Doreen and Morthal emerged from the side chamber behind them, and after a short battle, monsters were reduced to sizzling puddles. Encouraged by their swift victory, the party ventured deeper into the musty corridors of Abathor. She finally called out, her voice echoing along the silent halls. Her words brought the others to a halt. Doreen crossed her arms and surveyed the corridor again. She tapped the heel of her boot against the floor, thinking. Something felt off. Her gaze drifted back to the secret door that had been revealed long ago, a cunningly crafted passage that had once concealed something precious. If dwarves were consistent in their craftsmanship, then a temple like this, dedicated to a god of avarice, would not rely on just one hidden space. In her mind, the chamber's layout took shape. One secret door had been found on the left-hand side. If dwarven symmetry prevailed, logic demanded another on the opposite side. She scanned the stone carefully, Zyra's light dancing over runes half obliterated by time. Zyra drifted closer, curiosity lighting her features.
Find something?
The sorceress asked, arms folded, her voice quiet so as not to break Doreen's concentration. Doreen did not answer. She pressed her ear against the wall and listened, tapped twice, listened again. Her fingertips found a subtle dip in the masonry, a hairline crack so fine it seemed more illusion than reality. She pressed harder, feeling a shift. Her heart beat faster, that greedy drum quickening its pace again.
There.
She said, stepping back with a triumphant grin.
If they built one secret door, they built two.
Leaning forward, she worked a hidden latch or catch, and with a soft scrape of stone, the wall swung inward, revealing a narrow passage swallowed by darkness. The others hurried over, the torchlight creating flickering shadows that stretched across the newly revealed corridor. Doreen couldn't help the smirk, tugging at her lips. Despite her earlier disappointment, she had found something after all, a path at least. For Doreen, even the promise of hidden wonders stirred her spirit.
Forward?
Morthal asked quietly. No one voiced dissent. With careful steps, they pressed into the new corridor, and as they advanced, Doreen's heart drummed louder, fueled not by hope alone, but by the unending hunger that had brought her this far. They followed the narrow passage until it split into two forks. One route was blocked by a collapsed ceiling, and the other, after some careful steps, deposited them back into the main temple hall through another hidden doorway. Doreen let out an exasperated sigh as they re-entered the familiar chamber.
Back where we started?
She grumbled, tapping her fingertips against the smooth wall.
All that work for nothing.
Zyra stepped beside Doreen, whispering,
Not every secret leads to treasure.
but her tone was gentle. She remembered Doreen's sour mood outside, the weight of her pack. Perhaps her friend's greed stemmed from fear of scarcity, fear of failure. Zyra gave the rogue a sympathetic shrug.
I refuse to believe this is all there is. Abathor's temple should be bursting with treasures.
Doreen retraced her steps, fingers running along the carved stone.
We must have missed something.
She muttered, but found no new latch or hollow point. Growing frustrated, she turned to the sorceress.
Don't look at me. I'm trying my best to think like a dwarf here, and all I've got is a headache.
Morthal stepped forward with a thoughtful frown, lifting his lantern to study the architecture.
Temples often follow patterns.
He mused.
If one side hides a passage, then the opposite should again mirror it.
His fingers traced ancient runes until he found a subtle groove. With a gentle push, the stone yielded, and a concealed door grated open, releasing a musty breath of stale air. Doreen blinked, then chuckled, half annoyed, half admiring.
I should have guessed it'd be a cleric who finds it.
She said. Zyra arched a brow, her earlier frustration fading.
Well done, Morthal. Let's see what else these dwarves have tucked away.
Together they slipped through the newly revealed entrance, Morthal's divine light flickering against unseen walls, hearts hopeful once more. They crept along the cramped passageway, each step stirring up old dust that tickled their throats and pricked their eyes. The silence pressed in tight, broken only by the distant drip of water and their own muffled breaths. When Morthal eased open the next door, a stale gust rushed out, making Morthal's flame waver and elongate their shadows into flickering giants on the walls. At first, the corridor beyond looked no different from the others, just more deserted stone. But Morthal stopped short, raising his light. A ragged pile of stones drew his eye. He tilted his head, confused. Then he saw it, a gleaming trickle of thick liquid slithering between the rocks. His heart clenched. Ochre jelly. Before he could shout a warning, the goo had reached his boot. Morthal jerked back, but Doreen's shoulder pressed into him from behind, blocking his escape. He had no time to think. He hurled himself sideways, narrowly avoiding the writhing mass as it oozed forward, leaving a shining trail of slime.
Jelly!
Morthal's shout rang out, echoing in the darkness. Doreen reacted instantly, swearing under her breath as she slashed at the quivering mass. Her blade cut through it with a sickening hiss. The creature recoiled, then lunged again, forcing her to scramble backward, feet sliding on the dusty floor. Zyra raised her hands, red sparks dancing across her fingertips. She flung firebolts that burst into brilliant flares of light and heat. The jelly writhed, trying to ooze away, but Morthal stepped forward, jaw set, and unleashed a radiant blast that scorched the twisting lump. The thing sizzled, shrinking into a stinking puddle of inert goo that steamed and bubbled before going still. Panting in the sudden silence, they stood shoulder to shoulder, hearts pounding. The tunnel opened abruptly into a vast chamber bathed in an eerie, shifting glow. It shimmered over crumbled columns and walls, etched with faded murals. At the far end stood a towering dwarven statue, arms raised toward the ceiling as if presenting its prize. A gemstone of unearthly radiance. Light pulsed from it in slow, hypnotic flashes, casting prismatic patterns across the cracked floor. Doreen froze, transfixed. Her heart thundered in her chest. This was it. Her moment. Without waiting for the others, she darted forward, her boots scuffing against the stone. Zyra, further back, had been scanning the chamber's edges when her eyes caught a warning. A shattered statue, its remains scorched and scattered like the aftermath of an explosion.
Doreen, stop!
Zira's voice rang out, echoing in the vaulted space.
Don't touch it!
Too late. Doreen's hands closed around the gemstone. A deafening crack split the air, followed by a white-hot flash. Time seemed to warp. The gem erupted in an explosion of light and sound, a concussive wave that tore through the chamber. Shards of stone and molten crystal sprayed outward like daggers. Ilara, closer than the others, raised his swords just in time to shield his head. The force drove him back, but he avoided the worst of the shrapnel, emerging with only shallow scrapes on his arms. Doreen, standing at the epicenter, was flung backward like a rag doll. Her body struck the wall with a sickening thud, and she crumpled to the floor in a heap of dust and rubble. The world around her spun, a storm of soundless chaos. Her vision blurred, shapes swimming in and out of focus. She could see Morthal rushing toward her, his mouth moving, shouting something, but the words were swallowed in a deafening silence. Her ears rang with a high-pitched whine that drowned out everything else. She blinked hard, struggling to make sense of the distorted world around her. A moment later, she felt a sharp slap on her face. Gradually, Zira's face swam into view above her, streaked with fear and dust. The sorceress's lips moved again, her voice cutting through the haze in fragments.
Reckless, foolish girl.
The words grew clearer as the ringing in Doreen's ears began to subside.
You could have been killed.
Zira's trembling hands dusted off Doreen's shoulders and face with surprising gentleness, her earlier anger morphing into visible relief.
What were you thinking?
She hissed, though her tone wavered between scolding and fear. Doreen coughed, her breath hitching as tears streaked the dirt on her cheeks.
I'm sorry.
Doreen whispered, her voice hoarse. Her wide, glistening eyes darted to Zira's face, flickering with something that might have been genuine regret, or something more guarded, a habitual ploy to deflect judgment. For a fleeting second, Zira's expression tightened, a flicker of doubt crossing her features. But then she pulled Doreen into a firm embrace, holding her as if afraid to let go.
You're impossible,
She murmured, her voice softer now, tinged with a warmth she rarely showed. Morthal knelt beside them, his hands glowing with Helm's divine light as he began to heal Doreen's bruises and cuts. The cleric's gaze held a quiet understanding, but his silence spoke volumes about the folly of greed. As the dust settled, the chamber lay in ruins, the radiant gem now shattered into worthless fragments. Yet in the midst of the wreckage, Doreen leaned into Zira's embrace, trembling and unsure whether it was the warmth of comfort or the sting of humiliation that burned hotter. Above them, the towering statue seemed to glare, a silent reminder of the price of unchecked ambition. When the group stumbled out into the cool night air, their steps were uneven and weary from the ordeal. The chill nipped at their skin, a sharp contrast to the suffocating dust and oppressive glow of the chamber they had left behind. Daslin, Norbus, and Balin were already gathered around a modest campfire, their deep laughter echoing into the night. Balin sat there, a half-empty mug of dwarven ale in hand, his cheeks tinged with a faint flush of drink. The scent of roasted meat and strong spirits wafted toward the party. Morthal's gaze lingered on Balin, his brow furrowing as he realized the dwarf had once again slipped away during the thick of battle. Balin's movements were slow, his words slightly slurred as he chuckled at something Norbus said. Morthal didn't speak, but his shoulders sagged. "Glad you're back," Daslin said, rising quickly when he saw the other's state. His jovial demeanor shifted to concern as his sharp eyes took in the dirt-streaked faces and battered armor. "That bad in there?"
Worse?
Ilara said, lowering himself onto a nearby log. His twin swords clattered as he set them down, exhaustion etched in his face.
But it's done?
Norbus approached with a pair of small, ornately carved stones. "These are for you," he said, his gruff voice softened by gratitude. "Sending stones. We owe you for clearing those curse jellies and letting us get back to work without worrying about being digested." Morthal took the stones, weighing them in his hands before turning to Doreen and Zira.
Doreen scouts ahead, and Zyra stays with the main group,
he said, his tone even.
"If we must separate, these will keep us connected."
He placed a stone in each of their hands. Doreen stared at the smooth, cool surface for a long moment. For once, her mind wasn't filled with thoughts of value or worth. Instead, the weight of trust settled on her shoulders.
Thanks.
She murmured, voice unusually quiet. Zyra, meanwhile, tilted her head, eyes narrowing as she studied Morthal. She was surprised by his continued faith in them, faith in her, despite Doreen's reckless act and her own occasional self-serving tendencies. She tucked the stone into her belt pouch with a nod.
"You really do have a knack for generosity,"
she said lightly, though her words carried an undertone of respect. The campfire crackled warmly as they settled in. Daslin passed around mugs of dwarven ale, and Norbus carved thick slices from a roasted rabbit that Ilara had trapped. The rich smell of food and drink mingled with the cool night air, a balm to frayed nerves. Ilara sat a little closer to Morthal than usual, as if seeking the steady presence of the cleric. Morthal didn't comment, but he glanced at the elf with a quiet, reassuring smile. Zara sat across from Doreen, fussing with her hair ribbons and adjusting her gown, muttering complaints about the dust. Yet her eyes kept darting toward the rogue as though gauging her mood. Doreen, for her part, sat with slumped shoulders, her hands resting in her lap. Her pack lay beside her, a burden of riches but also a quiet reminder of the dangers greed could bring. She sipped from her mug, savoring the warmth of the ale but saying little. Balin remained at the fire, chuckling occasionally at Daslin's stories, but his gaze drifted now and then to Morthal. The cleric's earlier look of quiet concern stayed with him, a subtle reminder of expectations unmet. Though the ale softened the edges of his thoughts, a faint unease lingered, a weight that settled uncomfortably in his chest. The campfire burned low as the night deepened, casting long shadows that flickered and danced against the surrounding stones. The soft snores of Daslin and Norbus mingled with the occasional rustle of sleeping bags as the party rested. Balin snored faintly, his mug of ale still resting on a flat stone nearby, the weight of drink and guilt pulling him into a fitful sleep. Morthal stood at the camp's edge, his warhammer in hand, his shield strapped to his back. His watch had been uneventful so far, save for the gentle whisper of the wind and the distant calls of night birds. He inhaled deeply, the chill air filling his lungs, and whispered a quiet prayer to Helm for vigilance and protection. Yet something gnawed at him, a prickle at the back of his neck that refused to fade. Then he heard it, a faint scrape like metal against stone. Morthal froze, his breath catching, as his eyes swept the darkness beyond the campfire's reach. His grip on the hammer tightened, knuckles whitening as the sound came again, closer this time. Low, guttural voices followed, speaking in a language he didn't understand but whose intent was unmistakably hostile. The shadows at the edge of the camp shifted. Two hulking shapes emerged, stepping cautiously into the flickering firelight. Orcs, their faces twisted with cruel sneers, tusks glinting as they hefted axes coated with dark stains. The firelight danced on their battered armor, turning their silhouettes into menacing specters. Morthal inhaled slowly. There would be no shortage of challenges ahead, and now it was time, once again, to stand firm.
A shadow moves silent and swift, empty hands yearning for a gift. Coins in my palm, but never enough. The weight of gold, the heart stays rough. Eyes on the prize, blind to the cost. The more I take, the more I've lost. Voices fade, I turn away, chasing treasures that never stay. What is this hunger? What is this need? A restless fire, a hollow greed. I grasp at riches, I lose my ground, searching for something I've never found. Take, it's all the same. His words once sparked a fiery flame. The skills he gave, a thief's finesse, a precious gift or a cursed success. Behind the mask, a question grows, a fear, a truth I'll never show. What if it's not the gold I crave, but the warmth I push away? What is this hunger? What is this need? A restless fire, a hollow greed. I grasp at riches, I lose my ground, searching for something I've never found. Glimmer fades, the night feels cold. What's the price of a heart sold? Through shadows deep, I walk alone, seeking a treasure that feels like home.